Hi, my name is Sarah Witt. I'm the provost for Eastern Oregon University, and I would like to welcome you to the culturally responsive teaching practice session featuring Dr. Francisco Rios and Dr. French, Kristen French. So thank you all for being here. A huge thank you to Dr. Rios and Dr. French. And all of the colleagues from Eastern Oregon University for sharing your time this afternoon for this professional development opportunity in culturally responsive practices. It's no secret that EOU and other regional universities are among the early responders to the disruptive paradigm shift occurring in higher education. And so this faculty development opportunity around culturally responsive practices could not be more timely as we turn our attention to matters of diversity and the equity imperative at EOU. For EOU, the timing of the visit is critical for a number of reasons that pertain to the student population EOU serves and the engagement strategies we're using to catalyze student learning here. One bullet point that makes this a timely visit is that EOU's demographics are shifting toward more Hispanic students moving through the K-12 system in Oregon, and over 50% Hispanic population in large population centers like Hermiston and Ontario, Oregon. Within the next 2 to 5 years, these students will begin to enroll in institutions in Oregon and likely in the regional public universities first. During the same time frame, EOU's funding model is also shifting so that by 2020, 60% of funding received from the state will be based on the number of graduates with additional weightings for rurally situated, underserved, and minority populations. Third point to consider is that EOU is focused on recruiting this particular student population, as well as moving the needle on retention from 57% in fall of 2015 to being on track for a 71% retention rate by fall of 2016. And moving the needle nearly 20 points in 1 year indicates that we are already rethinking our strategies for engaging, recruiting, and retaining students of color and diverse cultural backgrounds. The addition of the TRIO Center has been just a wonderful addition to our university, and I expect that will have a lot to do with our future ability to sustain those retention numbers. Funding demographic shifts, recruitment and retention of current and future students are huge areas requiring a unified approach to responsive teaching practices in order for these students to be successful. Recently, this has required faculty to streamline curricula, to make it more accessible, to make a degree more attainable within 4 years, to add a dimension of experiential and research learning in the earlier years, and thus become more attractive, more engaging, more affordable by delivering these college courses to those populations that are coming to us and who are already taking early college credits in the high schools. We cannot respond to market shifts and respond appropriately to the shifting sands of higher education without dedicating this kind of time and these kinds of expert resources to our faculty development. This better prepares us to receive the diverse students that are coming to us and to respond to them in appropriate, culturally responsive ways that will help better support their learning environment and achievement of degrees at EOU. Again, I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon and your continuing commitment to serve our students with quality learning experiences at EOU. Tanya?
Thank you, Provost Witt. Welcome everyone in front of me and those online. This also is being live streamed today. My name is Tanya Lubis, and I'm faculty in the College of Education and also the director of the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices at Eastern Oregon University. Today we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Francisco Rios and Dr. Kristen French, who's in the back. And they will be, over the next 2 days, giving a 3-part professional development series to you all, faculty and staff right now. This evening, a keynote, and tomorrow, a K-12 teacher workshop. To introduce Dr. Rios, who will just be presenting today for you all, he is the Dean of Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University. He received his PhD from University of Wisconsin and worked at California State University, San Marcos, and the University of Wyoming before arriving to Washington. And in case you didn't know, Western Washington is located in Bellingham. He served as interim associate dean at CSUSM and department chair at the University of Wyoming, and his research interests include teachers of color, Latinos in education, and pre-service teacher education with a multicultural focus. Dr. Rios is the senior associate editor of Multicultural Perspectives, which is the journal of the National Association for Multicultural Education, and one of you will win a copy today. He spent spring of 2005 as a Fulbright Fellow at Pontificia Universidad Católica Valparaíso in Chile. He also served as program chair for Division K of the American Educational Research Association annual program in 2007. Dr. Rios has served as the founding director of University of Wyoming's Social Justice Research Center, and in 2008, he received the Distinguished Scholar Mid-Career Award from the Committee of Scholars of Color in Education from the American Educational Research Association. He is also the current president of the National Association for Multicultural Education, so we really do have a celebrity here with us today. Dr. Rios has significantly contributed to the field of education. He's received over 30 grants and awards for his work. He has 42 articles, 20 book chapters, and 8 books that are continuously cited globally. Further, he's given over 200 presentations at the local, state, national, and international levels, including presentations in Australia, Chile, and Guatemala. And today, he's in La Grande, Oregon with us, and he has a lot to share with us about the changing field of education and meeting the needs of diverse learners. So please join me in welcoming him to Eastern Oregon University.
Yeah, thank you. That was lovely, thank you. Thanks for doing that. Thank you, Tanya. Well, distinguished teachers and colleagues and compañeras, compañeros, hermanas y hermanos todos. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. It's great to have you here. Thank you for this invitation, for some opportunity for me to come and share some thoughts with you about how we might extend culturally responsive pedagogy into multicultural education, as well as global engagement that's rooted in human rights principles. I bring you peace from Mount Baker and the majestic Cascade Range with their jagged, rocky peaks and incredible mountain vistas, with its wildflowers bursting this spring, the renewal of life, which remind us, if we listen, to always walk in beauty. I bring you peace from the Salish Sea, home of the Coast Salish people, and this renewing abundance of water, life-giving water that nourishes us with its rich diversity of sea life, and which reminds us, if we listen, to always walk in wonder. It's an honor to be in your presence, an honor to have been given this invitation to talk. But when Tanya called me and invited me to give this talk, she may have noticed that there was a pause in this invitation. And in that pause, this recording went off in my head, and it's a comedy routine from Bob Goldthwait. And I don't know if you all know that Bob Goldthwait. He has that like real high, screechy voice, like. And he was describing being in the room when his wife was giving birth to their first child. and the baby comes out, and the doctor says, Mr. Goldthwait, would you like to cut the umbilical cord? And he says, isn't there somebody better qualified? If I do, will you knock $200 off the bill? So when Tanya called to invite me, I was thinking, isn't there somebody better qualified to do this? And the truth is, I'm not qualified to give this presentation, but I stand on the shoulders of many people who've lifted me up. I do not stand alone. I'm lifted by the consejos de las mujeres, ángeles todas, the advice of women, angels all. I'm lifted by the confianza of all those who I call mentors and who trusted me. I'm lifted by the mutual respeto of and for my students and of my colleagues. And I'm lifted by the coraje, the courage and anger. I love that word coraje, courage and anger of those who make a difference and who compel me to make a difference every day. I'm lifted by my colleague and friend Kristen for all her consejos, confianza, respeto, and coraje that she embodies. She stands with me here. And I want to acknowledge for this particular presentation one of my former graduate students, Susie Marcus, who worked closely with me on this particular framework that I'm planning to share today. As I mentioned, I do not stand alone. I've come to Washington from, most recently, Wyoming. I was honored to work with Arapaho and Shoshone elders on the Wind River Reservation, who are working to revitalize their endangered languages. These Newa and Na Besiwa, Arapaho grandmothers and grandfathers, are doing some of the most important work that is being done in schools in America. For in working to revitalize their language, they are working to revitalize their culture, that which makes them human, their lifeways, their essence, and their nation. And they begin their public meetings with a prayer, a spiritual offering, if you will. And I've been thinking about the spiritual in education, pondering the impact of its absence, and wondering about the role of the spiritual in a way that invites all people in and excludes no one. Not the spiritual as many others think about it in terms of religion, but the spiritual as described by advocates of holistic education, as that which brings beauty, wisdom, compassion, and service. Beauty, wisdom, compassion, and service, all too often missing in our nation's classrooms today. I just realized the poem I was going to read, I did not pull it out. I got to grab that. So I'm going to offer a spiritual offering to you as a form of testimony or a form of testimonial. And this poem affirms the importance of one's identity and valuing the integrity of others in ways that are small and big, in math and science, art, and even, yes, music. And what happens when we fail to do so and violate one's human rights in the process? So this is a poem that comes from a poet named Lawson Inara, and it's called Rayford's Song. And here's how it goes. Rayford's song was Rayford's song, but it was not his alone to own. He had it, though, and he kept it to himself as we rowed the boat through English country gardens with all the whispering hope we could muster, along with the occasional choruses of Funiculi, Funiculi. Weren't we a cheery lot, coming round the mountain with Susanna, banjo on our knees, romping through the leaves of the third grade music textbook. Then Rayford Butler raised his hand, for the first time, actually, in all the weeks he had been in class, and for the only time before he'd leave. Yes, quiet, Rayford, Silent Rayford, Little Rayford, Dark Rayford, always in the same overalls. That Rayford, Rayford Butler, raised his hand. Miss Gordon, ma'am, we always sing in your songs. Could I sing one of my own? Pause. We looked at one another. We looked up at Rayford Butler. We looked up at Miss Gordon, who said, well, I suppose so, Rayford. If you insist, go ahead. But just one song. Make it short. And Rayford Butler stood up very straight and in his high voice sang, swing a low, swing a chariot, a comin' for to carry me home. Pause. Classroom, school, schoolyard, neighborhood, the whole world focusing on that one song, that one voice who had a light in it, making even Miss Gordon's white hair shine in the glory of it, glowing in the radiance of that song. Pause. Rayford Butler sat down, and while the rest of us may have been spellbound, on Miss Gordon's face was something like a frown, a smile, or perhaps a frown. Very good, Rayford. However, I must correct you. The word is chariot. Chariot. There is no such thing as a chariot. Do you understand me? But Miss Gordon, I said chariot. Chariot. Can you pronounce that with me? Yes, Miss Gordon. Chariot. Very good, Rayford. Now, class, before we return to our book, would anyone else care to sing a song of their own? Our songs were there, on tips of tongues, but stuck in throats. Songs of love and fun and animals and valor. Songs of other lands and other languages, but they just wouldn't come out. Where did our voices go? Rayford's song was Rayford's song, but it was not his alone to own. Well then, class, let's turn our books to Old Black Joe. Isn't that an absolutely beautiful poem? There is today this need to achieve harmony in a world that's defined by human diversity and all of its manifestations, religious, ethnic, racial, linguistic. And that diversity is crucial to the very survival of the human species and our global planet. Now, our societies have always been diverse. This is not a new phenomenon. We've always had indigenous people wherever we are, and we should give thanks to the band of Umatilla people whose land we were on, and those people who both we know and don't know, whose bones rest on the land of this university. There's always been national and ethnic minority people in every society. There's always been immigration and movement of people between and across borders. And so this diversity is not a new phenomenon. It is both our legacy, and as your provost mentioned, is our trajectory. But it's true that diversity is increasing, and it's increasing due to immigration, it's increasing due to globalization, and it's increasing due to displacement, the ways in which wars that are created by other nations create disruption in other nations, which then create situations where they're forced to leave. And people who come do not leave their cultural orientations, their values, their worldviews, their cultural repertoires of practice in their home settings or at the border. They're demanding recognition. They're rejecting the immorality of forced assimilation. That is, being forced to make a choice between being successful either at school or being successful at home and in the community. So we have to accept the reality of transnationalism, affirm diversity, and pursue global harmony. And perhaps we need to do that by way of thinking about this in terms of creating global cosmopolitanism, which is appealing to just a broader universal humanity and human rights and world citizenship, something that I'm going to be doing as I frame the work that I'm going to share today. And above all of this, education has a really important role to play in this, and that includes increasing our efforts to diversify our curriculum, to increase the presence of people of color on our campuses, to increase the presence of faculty of color and academic programs that meet the needs of this more diverse nation. I'd argue that enacting a culturally responsive pedagogy is also one way to respond to the education debt that Martin Luther King spoke about in his I Have a Dream speech. As well, it's important that we recognize that it's not just this education debt that we're trying to deal with, but we're also trying to close not an achievement gap, because the achievement gap is really best understood as an opportunity gap. Who has the opportunities to be successful, and how have we created those opportunities or not? So it's best understood as who's going to be successful in the broadest sense, and how do we create schools and universities that assure success in the most broad sense. Institutions of higher education like our K-12 partners have perhaps an even more critical role to play in upholding these human rights as one way to pay the debt and close the opportunity gap. Stavenhagen wrote in 2008, quote, "In today's globalized and interconnected world, living together peacefully has become a moral, social, and political imperative on which depends, to a great extent, the very survival of humankind. No wonder that education in its widest sense is called upon to play a major role in the worldwide shared task." So here's my proposition for this particular talk. I wonder if, or I want to suggest that, access to quality, diversity, and affirming education is a human right. So I'm not talking about why do we do this work because of change of demographics or whatever, but rather I want to think about, is access to quality, diversity education, multicultural education, a fundamental human right? Now, multicultural education has been centering human rights education for a long time, so this is not new. Most of the focus, however, when we think about multicultural education and how it connects with human rights, is saying that human rights training should be one part of multicultural education. But what I want to do is offer two new extensions. Can multicultural education and diversity in education help us to pursue human rights principles? And is there value in multicultural education that can be extended by rooting itself in human rights principles? In other words, this connection between human rights and multicultural education working to positively and mutually influence each other in important ways. Thus far, I don't think it has done either. Now, I want to just mention a word about my words here. I'm going to be using the word multicultural education, even though I know that we're with the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices, and culturally responsive pedagogy is an important, but just one framework under which other people enact multicultural education, and a very powerful and a very important framework. So it makes sense that multicultural education, which actually has many different frameworks, it makes sense to have complementary frameworks. And it would make sense that you would have multiple ways that you do multicultural education, right? Because to say that there would only be one way to do multicultural education would be antithetical to multicultural education, right? So I'm going to use multicultural education in the broadest sense and recognize culturally responsive pedagogy as one powerful framework for accomplishing it, but also just one particular framework. So how did I come to this proposition about quality education, multicultural education, and its connection to human rights? As Tanya mentioned, I was editor of the Journal of Multicultural Education for 10 years. When I became dean, soon after that, I stepped down from being the journal editor. I just couldn't do both things. And after 10 years, it was probably time for other people to take over. And one of the things that I was thinking about was I was always getting articles a lot, and I was always interested in how did people frame the problem space, right? How were they thinking about, this is why we have to do this work, right? Most of the time, what I saw was that people were using fairly similar frames to describe why we needed to do this multicultural education. Often that frame was in just talking about the change of demographics. You get people putting all these statistics together about changing demographics. Then sometimes they wouldn't just talk about the change in demographics, they would then connect it to statistics around academic achievement, right? So that was probably the most popular frame in which people were writing articles about multicultural education as a way to frame what the problem was. Sometimes another frame that people used was around developing cultural consciousness or critical consciousness or cultural identity development. So they were really using kind of a developmental focus and talking about how do you come from kind of a monocultural orientation to a multicultural orientation. And usually they advance these kind of stage theories that you start here, from knowing yourself to knowing others to looking at systems of oppression to eventually developing social action skills. So it's generally something like that. But there are several people that have those kind of cultural competence stage-specific models. My concern about the first approach is that while the demographics are changing, and we need to acknowledge that, and that while the academic achievement gap is definitely a problem, oftentimes people assume that to mean, well, if those people weren't here, then we wouldn't have the achievement gap, right? As opposed to, again, thinking about it in terms of opportunity gap. My issue with stage models is that it assumes, in fact, that there's some end point, that you reach some point of nirvana, or I'm not sure what it is, that you get the golden halo of multiculturalism, and that you no longer have to do the really hard, difficult, everyday, day-to-day work and learning that this requires. Neither of these models really address questions of power, privilege, structural racism, institutional racism, the broader narratives around race and diversity and education. Rare still, but once in a while, I'd get these really great articles that would talk about things like countering the contemporary colonization project. Wow, that's really great. Or challenging hegemony. These were people who were willing to name it and put it on the line and say, ultimately, this is what this work needs to help us to do. And education, as a result, needs to help us to develop the kind of critical conscientiousness, I can't even say the word, critical consciousness to help us speak back against that colonization and that broader hegemony. So as I looked at that, I was thinking about these three frames and just wondering, okay, those are great, but is there a way to extend the frame somehow to yet one other argument or one other way of positioning our work? And for me, that was to begin thinking about multicultural education as a human rights. That led me, in turn, to go to the United Nations and to begin looking at some documents that the United Nations had put out around human rights generally. You can go back to 1948, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and in that declaration, they immediately, the very first declaration, talked about the importance of access to an education that was free, compulsory, and lifelong. And because I think it's important, I'm going to read exactly what that says. Education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. So you can see that the focus was on free, compulsory, lifelong education and ended with talking about the importance of teaching human rights. The focus was on the rights of the whole child, but it talked about it in the context of the whole child as an individual. And it included world peace, world friendship, and peace. More recently, the focus has turned to quality education. If you look at UNESCO's medium-term strategy, they begin talking about the importance of the diversification of educational content and materials, as well as methods, combating neoliberalism, since it leads to a two-tiered education system, one that's both private and elite, and one that is public and poor, And they began to talk about the importance of addressing gender inequalities, educational exclusion, and school dropouts. Well, really, the next major advance on human rights and the human rights principles came in the UN Convention of the Child in 1989. And what they did is they reinforced the previous freedoms that I just mentioned. They said, yep, free, compulsory, lifelong education. But they also added some new principles, and I thought these are really important. So they added Section C, and it reads, Section C, the development of respect for the child's parents, his or her own cultural identity, language, and values, for the national values of the country in which the child is living, the country from which he or she may originate, and for civilizations different from her or his own. So for the first time, they began saying people essentially have a right to learn about their social identities, the social identity group that they're coming from and with, and the social identities of people that they're going to be encountering in their new land. In those states, they also talk about, they coupled cultural and linguistic rights with individual rights as part of human rights. They said, in quote, in those states where ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities or persons of indigenous origin exist, a child belonging to such a minority who is indigenous should not be denied the right, in community with other members of his or her group, to enjoy his or her own culture, to profess and practice his or her own religion, and to use his or her own language. So you can see that the United Nations has been really now moving towards talking about affirming diversity, not as something why we should do it in terms of demographics, but really that this is a human right principle. And I will say that, and I think this is important, they did add one other provision. It was actually E, which is that education should help with the development of respect for the natural environment, given the global crisis that we're not about to experience, we're beginning to experience. I think this is an important provision of that. Now, all of this got even further jump in the year 2001, and if you have any time, I would strongly encourage you to go read UNESCO's Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity that was written in 2001, and it's just beautiful. It's just absolute prose in its very best. In that Declaration of Cultural Diversity, and I'll just pull out a couple of quotes because I think they're so cool. Cultural diversity is seen as a source of exchange, innovation, and creativity, and necessary for as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is to nature. They talked about, quote, the importance of ensuring harmonious interaction among people and groups with plural, varied, and dynamic cultural identities, as well as a will to live together. And then they said, quote, this is an ethical imperative, inseparable from respect for human dignity. It implies a commitment to human rights and fundamental freedoms. So here, in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was this powerful link between education rights and cultural diversity rights that I thought was really instructive. So this led me and my colleague, Susie Marcus, to begin thinking about, well, what do these rights look like? And if we were going to help people to kind of understand how these rights are framed, what might that framework look like? And we posited that there were 7 freedoms, 7 rights that every child has a right to, but we clustered them along 3 dimensions: psychocultural, or right, kind of individual cultural rights, their individual cultural sense; social cultural rights, the right to be in harmony and in collaboration and cooperation with people like them and also people different from them; and then cultural democratic rights, the rights to be fully human and to live and work as a human, as a citizen in their particular country and space that they find themselves. So that's really what we came to. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is I'm going to talk about these, and I'm going to start from the bottom and move up, because in a way, is the way that we thought about it, this is kind of like the foundational work that you have to do that eventually will be important for you as you move up the particular continuum. So the first right is the psychocultural right, the right to see oneself in the curriculum. And education has too often worked against this part in its efforts to subordinate groups to the nation state. It has also done this in an effort to deliberately erase some people's cultural identities, and it included indigenous people, but other non-European identities in particular. Seeing oneself in the curriculum is essential for empowerment and is a prerequisite for the kind of cosmopolitanism that I just spoke about. Failure to do so results in deculturalization that Joel Springs talks about, or subtractive schooling that Angela Valenzuela talks about. People need to see themselves positively and respectfully in the curriculum. This requires teachers to learn about their students' social identities and to see them in non-stereotypical ways, especially by way of learning about how people in the local community understand their particular identities, their history, their culture, and their politics. Adrienne Rich, who I hope many people have read this, I hope you've heard this quote many times, but she wrote about, in her book, The Invisibility in Academia, these powerful words, quote, "When those who have power to name and to socially construct reality choose not to see you or hear you, whether you are dark-skinned, old, disabled, female, or speak with a different accent or dialect than theirs, when someone with an authority of a teacher, say, describes the world and you are not in it, there is a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. Yet you know you exist, and others like you, that this is a game of mirrors. It takes some strength of the soul, and not just individual strength, but collective understanding to resist this void, this non-being into which you are thrust, and to stand up, demanding to be seen and heard." End of quote. The second right is an epistemological or cognitive justice right. This is really the right to be exposed to and see different ways of knowing and explaining the world. The idea that we use a single epistemological lens, a single way of thinking about knowledge and whose knowledge and what knowledge counts and how we assess knowledge and how people come to know, that we use just a single epistemological ends up in what some people are calling epistemological racism, especially when we know that there are an endless map of knowledges available in our world. People have a right to access differing epistemological orientations. And I'm really glad that there are important university and research centers, departments and academic programs, especially working hard to document and extend these subjugated epistemologies. In the United States, that especially plays out in women's studies programs, LGBTQ studies programs, ethnic studies programs, et cetera. They're the ones that are really holding on to and documenting these different epistemological frameworks, these different ways of thinking about knowing the world. What's really important about this right is that it's not merely about bringing students' cultural ways into the classroom, but it's about reconstituting our very models of humanness and modes of being, because it asks us to learn to think differently about the world. Charlotte and Ballinger described it this way: social justice is not possible without cognitive justice, without recognizing the presence of different forms of understanding, knowing, and explaining the world. All forms of knowledge have to be present and valued in relation to one another. Faced with the endless map of knowledges, the conclusion is that it is impossible to have a single general theory about the meaning of education and knowledge. Education needs to be a central task of the political system, and political power should help not only in funding it, but also in having as a priority the fight against obscuring the non-Western knowledge and local forms of education. End of quote. We'll move now to the social cultural rights, and the very first one is people have a right to freedom from discrimination. In fact, one of the UN conventions was the UN Convention on the Freedom from Discrimination. Much of this early work focused on the interpersonal discrimination, and Gordon Allport's The Nature of Prejudice, seminal work, the very first what I would call multicultural education book that I ever read, was really at the height of trying to understand how is it that an individual develops a prejudicial perspective and operates that prejudicial practices out against others. I think more recently we've recognized that while that individual racism and prejudice and discrimination is one level, there are also other levels that kind of nest and make possible that individual racism and discrimination. And I'm thinking here about work around that people are raising around institutional racism and how does institutional racism kind of allow for interpersonal racism. How racism at the societal, thinking about narrative, what's the dominant narrative or what's the grand narrative that we have? What's the discourse and discourses people are using? And of course, all we have to do is look today at some of the political discourse and you can get a sense of how does that political discourse kind of allow for people to, again, engage in discriminatory practices. And finally, at the philosophical level, which is really at what we talked about previously, which is at kind of the epistemological level, about how do we understand civilizations to be and what's valued within that particular framework. Sleater and Grant call this the human rights approach. I know that you had Christine Sleater here. That was one of her approaches to multicultural education, not one that she encouraged, but certainly one that she said is sometimes valuable when you add it to other approaches to multicultural education. James Banks describes prejudice reduction as one of his 5 goals in multicultural education. Sonia Nieto talks about multicultural education having to be anti-racist. Critical race theory centers this question about freedom from discrimination, and it includes important projects such as Project Respect and, of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Any of those of you who are clued in or tied into the teaching tolerance work, you see what kind of a strong anti-racist stance that they have. In discussing South Africa's move from thinking about cultural diversity and pluralism to take an anti-racist education, Van de Jaar wrote, "At the heart of these debates has been the concern that racism still survives in institutional practices across the country. This has led to a shift from multicultural education to anti-racist education, from a preoccupation with cultural difference to an emphasis on the way such differences are used to entrench inequality." The next sociocultural right is the right to learn about and from others. The goal here is interculturality, what UNESCO wrote as, quote, "the existence and equitable interaction of diverse cultures and the possibility of generating shared cultural expressions through dialogue and mutual respect." This is really about learning from others as one way to assure cognitive justice, because as you interact with and learn from and with others, you are learning about different epistemological orientations, different ways of thinking about the world, different ways of being in the world. The goal, however, is always to get students to be able to interact competently across difference. This goes all the way back to John Dewey, who wrote, quote, "The emphasis must be put upon whatever binds people together in cooperative human pursuits and results. The secondary and provisional character of national sovereignty in respect to the fuller, freer, or more fruitful association and intercourse of human beings with one another must be instilled as a working disposition of mind." I love that idea that this should be a working disposition of our mind. The third one is as we begin to interact with others and recognize different epistemological frameworks, we begin to have a broader vision of reality, a broader vision of what's possible, a broader vision about how people can walk in the world. All the previous rights then, in a sense, kind of lead to this one. A monocultural perspective results in a limited vision of reality. And it's only through multiple perspectives that we increase our knowledge, our insight is enhanced, and it leads to being able to make better decisions about things, which is why we often work in groups and teams, right? Because we recognize that as we hear from and recognize multiple perspectives, we're going to come up with a better understanding of the issue and resolve it in a better way. But it's not about changing one knowledge for another, but it's really about how do we expand so that all those knowledges can be held in our space. So it includes telling many stories from within the same social identity group, so that way we're combating stereotypes. And this evening, if you're able to come in, we'd love to have you here. Dr. French and I are going to be talking about story and storying and sharing our stories in ways that hopefully disrupt maybe some stereotypical understandings about what it means to be Latino and what it means to be Native American. I think back with respect to this, the important words that James Baldwin wrote in 1963 in his Talk to Teachers. And if you haven't read that recently, I'd encourage you to go back and read it, or if you've never read it at all, it's a great piece. And in it, he wrote about the importance of having a broader vision of reality. But he's talking about the importance of people from the majority group having a broader vision of reality. When he wrote, quote, "If, for example, one managed to change the curriculum in all the schools so that Negroes learn more about themselves and their real contributions to this culture, you would be liberating not only Negroes, you'd be liberating white people who know nothing about their own history. And the reason is that if you were compelled to lie about one aspect of anybody's histories, you have to lie about it all. If you lie about the real role, about my real role here, if you have to pretend that I hoed all that cotton just because I loved you, then you have done something to yourself. You are mad." End of quote. As we move to now thinking about cultural democratic rights, here we think about those long-standing right about learning about human rights in and of itself. And so this is a long-standing right. And again, I talked about it when I read the 1948 Declaration, which talked about learning about human rights and human rights education. The focus is on teaching human rights and how to defend these rights for oneself and one others. For those of you who are able and can find it, the Manual on Rights-Based Education that was developed by UNESCO, Bangkok, and the U.S. Special Rapporteur was a really gold mine of a document. It includes both standards as well as methodologies. Basically what they said is that teaching human rights has to be done in a student-centered, respectful, and participatory way. Human rights also have to have a foci on multicultural education. It includes a focus on human agency and the right to assert these very rights themselves. At end, human rights education is about empowerment. Gundara wrote, "One of the ways to build bridges of understanding between and among people of various cultures and religions will require an increased appreciation of human rights and the base on which these are built, notably the concept of a shared acceptance of the premise of human dignity. In a period when alienation and cynicism are rife, the role of formal education as utilitarian is simply not enough." The last of these rights is agency and democratic education. So I see this link between education rights and broader human rights, because we have to have concerns about women's rights, about children's rights, about sustainability in our planet, about having a living wage and being able to have a job that's meaningful. All of these rights are part and parcel of the broader human rights, which are part and parcel of what we need to be teaching our students about in education. The Declaration of Education Rights sought to ensure that all young people can participate meaningfully in their education and gain the tools to build a just, democratic, and sustainable world. So how do we prepare young people within school context to address these broader human rights? The goal is, first of all, to have students see themselves as actors and history makers. History doesn't just happen to them, they can create history. Second, they have to take a social justice approach to education, because in particular, social justice education really exemplifies the right to engage all people, to critically analyze circumstances, and to develop social action and coalition building skills. Some important groups that are doing fabulous work on here: Educators for Social Responsibilities, Teachers for Social Justice, Rethinking Schools, et cetera. There's some really great groups out there that are really trying to figure out what does that actually look like in practice. So I want to just share with you before I end here just some thoughts for you about how we might go about doing this. So first I'd say learn about others. And I would encourage you to learn not only about their one story, but their multiple stories. Strive to understand as well how they think about the world and what are those epistemological frameworks and orientations that they're bringing. Second, learn with and from our students, especially our students from marginalized communities. Identify and listen to them when they talk about where they feel marginalized, and engage them in critically analyzing, then acting to resolve those points. Learn about human rights education itself. As I mentioned, there's some great materials and great people doing great work out there. Expand the canon. Expand what we understand and know, and actively teach multiple perspectives. But also attend not only to the content, but attend to multiple instructional strategies, using narratives, using nature-self connections, spirituality, dual consciousness, poetry, prose, dance, theater. I mean, using multiple methodologies, teaching methodologies would also be important. Next, take an anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic stance at both the individual, the institutional, and the ideological level. Act at the institutional level to forge more inclusive policies and practices. Those of us, especially in administration, have a particular obligation, but faculty as well have to be diligent about what are those structures, what are those policies, what are those practices that work for some people, but actually marginalize and cast others outside of the circle. And finally, this is hard work, and it's important to build alliances and connect with others. It was great to meet Tanya and to learn a little bit more about what you all are doing. I think we're going to have some good connections as we move forward in the future, because this is tough work, and it's hard to do it on your own, and so we can only do this work when we forge the kind of alliances and connect with others in really important ways. There's actually some really great work being done to bring human rights, education rights, and cultural diversity rights together as they merge into multicultural education. Here are some examples of Greenland and New Zealand. I had a chance to meet with the folks from the Alaska Native Knowledge Network in Alaska. They're doing amazing work. And then the Student Educational and Cultural Movement in India, so that there are examples of people doing this really good work. And at the heart of these, all of those models that I have lifted up, that I've listed there, are robust, authentic, deep connections with people across difference, and then seeing themselves as vital actors in their life circumstances. So I conclude with asking, is or might multicultural education be a premier pedagogical framework, not because it's helping us to address demographic challenges or an achievement gap or an opportunity gap, but really because it's going to help us to uplift and affirm people's human rights. At minimum, I would certainly assert multicultural education is at least an initial, if not partial, but essential understanding. It's going to require us to think about how we train teachers and faculty differently. It's going to require us to change our institutional practices. It's going to ask us to challenge our hegemonic ideologies and discourses, and it's going to ask us to build important alliances. So I wonder, can education that's multicultural be considered a human right? I see tremendous possibility in the ways in which multicultural education can, in fact, advance these universal human rights. In the words of Fitzsimmons, if nothing else, their convergence brings together the conditions of possibility for education and educators at the intersection of discourses of the integrated world order on the one hand and those of the forces of difference on the other. Muchísimas gracias y vamos adelante. Thank you very much, and let's move forward.
Kristen and Karen will be passing around some evaluations. If you could give us your feedback.
I've already filled them out, though, so not to worry. I was just so-so.
If you could take a few minutes and give us some feedback. This is particularly important because we like to know what you learned, and we like to know where you want us to go next. We plan on continuing this work next year as well. And then we have some time for some questions.
Great. Or comments.
So if folks have questions or comments, but because we have live stream folks, we want to ensure that we do ask the questions using the microphone. So I have a special request. Oh.
I got a mic.
Oh, he's got a mic. Never mind, he's good. Thank you, AB and Pollard, for all the work. So if there's any questions, let us know, and apparently we don't need this mic for that, correct?
And I have questions for you. You know, like if you're a good teacher, you always have questions for your students if they don't, because it doesn't feel very good when you're just waiting, doing counting crocodiles. Those of you who are teachers would know what that means, right? One crocodile, two crocodile.
And I do have a door prize, and you're not going to believe this. I promise it's not rigged, but Naomi, again, won. So I will put it back in. Actually, I already did. And the second person actually is Cedronio Rangel. So you won.
Yeah.
It'll be some great reading for you. So I'll give that to you. And then questions, please. We do have some time left. And it's not every day we have these amazing people on campus with a plethora of knowledge to share with all of you. So.
I'm wondering about resources for building critical consciousness in white students, and particularly students from predominantly white areas, like the brand right now at least. But if there are, do you know of any organizations that are doing work in building curriculum aimed at helping them develop critical consciousness within communities that may not provide them the needed exposure, like multiple racial or ethnic background?
Right. And Kristen, by the way, if you have some thoughts on that, I don't know if you heard that question. She asked about resources for helping white students to develop critical consciousness. I don't know if you want to share some thoughts. I'll share some initially, and then, you know, in kind of an unfortunate way, I think much of teacher education is actually built to do that, to actually create that kind of, at least multicultural education generally in most teacher ed. Because if you look at most teacher education programs, they're predominantly white students. And, you know, I think I think teacher ed would be differently if you envisioned that the student population that you were mostly going to serve would be ethnic minority students. But that's not the case in like 90% of teacher education programs. So I think we tend to construct teacher education programs and multicultural education within them having white students in mind. So in a way, it's kind of the default approach. Now, whether it's effective or not, I mean, we can certainly discuss that, right? I mean, there's questions about, do we do it in one class? Do we infuse it throughout? Do we do it in one class and infuse it throughout? Do we do it in 3 classes? You know, you're trying to change people's kind of 18, 19 years, 20 years if it's traditional student, longer if you're talking about untraditional student, ways of thinking about and being in the world. And so how is just one class or one set of experiences really gonna transform that? But we try, and I don't suggest, I'm not suggesting that we give up, though there's probably some days I feel like I should give up, or we feel like we should give up. I think you do it in partnership with others who are doing the work, especially organizations like several of the organizations that I talked about, where teachers are coming together, especially to teach each other and talk with each other. I love Rethinking Schools. We're going to be using a lot of Rethinking Schools work. The poem Rayford Song came from Rethinking Schools because it's teachers talking to teachers, right? And the other part of it is, and the challenge of it is that most teachers, and it doesn't matter what ethnic background, have not had models of teachers who teach from a social justice perspective. So part of it is we're kind of making this up. I mean, we need people to be creative and inventive and kind of show us. And so I think we think about how are those organizations like the organization Multicultural Education, the National Association of Multicultural Education, the International Association for Intercultural Education, the Korean Association for Multicultural Education internationally. But then, nationally, some of the ones that I talked about. I think the White Privilege Conference might be a really great place to send some people to really think about what does it mean to have privilege as a result of, simply as a result of the color of your skin. And then I think it's partnership work that we engage in with each other where we're learning from each other. And because, as I mentioned, my issue with stage theories of a cultural consciousness is it assumes that there's this endpoint for our students, but I also think we can't assume that like somehow I've also attained that as a faculty member, right? I always have to keep learning. But I'll turn it over to Kristen and ask her, because I think in particular, the work that she's engaged in our Center for Education, Equity, and Diversity, but also our work with Project Reach. It might be two other sources, but Kristen?
Thank you. Hi, Francisco, you touched on so many wonderful things, and I think what I'll just add to that is just some resources. And, first starting with your Center for, Culturally Responsive Practices is a great space, and we had so many wonderful conversations just already. We are partnering from now on. Once you build relationships with folks, you maintain them. So we recently had Robin DiAngelo come to campus, and for those of you who are not familiar with her, I'd really encourage you to look at her work. She has a co-authored book called Is Everyone Really Equal? Key Concepts in Social Justice Education with Azam Sensoy. And they're really just framing the work of social justice, but she also goes into critical white studies too. And recently, she came to campus and was talking about the importance of doing white affinity groups. And I guess another resource in that is really to understand the cycles of socialization, the way that we've been socialized. We're born into the communities in the world, and depending on your faith-based system, you may have asked for that lesson and journey, and some of us may not have. But it is our responsibility to understand the ways we've been socialized and socially constructed, but then also understanding the cycles of liberation, that we don't have to accept the ways we've been socialized. So the most important part, of course, in all that is that it, as Francisco is saying, it's a process. And so what I like to share with my students is that it's like exercise, right? We know we should be doing it 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 60 minutes, right? And we probably should be doing it every day. So justice work is like exercise. We should be doing it every day for 30 to 60 minutes. And I'm joking, but in the real sense, we should be doing this work every single day, all day long. And that will help us. We think of it in terms of a lifelong process rather than, as Francisco suggested, a workshop or a weekend retreat or a course, that we make that commitment. So building the relationships to do that commitment work is really essential.
Yeah. Her work on white fragility in particular is, how is it that, especially when you start talking about race and racism, students in particular become almost fragile, and you have to negotiate those conversations in particular ways is really, really quite good. And I'll give a shout out to the Summer Institute that we do at Western. We try to encourage people in teams to come together, 4 or 5 people to come. This year the focus is going to be on STEM, but it's really also going to challenge differing epistemologies about how do we come to know in a science and math world. And I think that would be great. So in case you want to go in, I think one of the things a suggestion that Kristen made to Tanya that worked really well at Western was to create a small group of multicultural fellows, people who would come together a couple of times every month, committed to doing it. We didn't pay them because we didn't want them to be there because they weren't going to get paid, but they committed to coming together to work with and support each other around diversity issues. And it's in a place like LeGrand, that might be really important. And I'd probably add to it in particular to invite some new faculty in to have those opportunities to be socialized and begin thinking about diversity, but also making those college, cross-departmental connections and develop shared networks and relations, I think would be, we probably could talk about that for a long time. A great question, and it's really the big question in the field, quite honestly. Yeah.
Just FYI, we have a subscription to Retaking Schools in the library and online, so you can access that journal anytime. We have subscription to the National Association for Multicultural Ed. We're lifetime members, institutional members. We have a ton of resources that we've purchased for the center, but also in the library that are available. So we do have a lot of resources available on campus
But those are the places where we get renewed, right? We need that renewal ourselves because this is tough work. Others? Remember, I'll start asking you questions. Okay. So here's two questions that maybe you could just real quickly with a partner, whoever's close to you, can answer either one or the other. And then I'd just love to just kind of hear you, share what you talked about. In what ways would framing multicultural education as a human right change the conversations that you're having about culturally responsive practices and pedagogy? And if culturally responsive pedagogy is a human right, what can the institution do to help close the opportunity gap, pay the education debt, and affirm these human rights? And what can you do? Okay, so pair up real quick here. Can do a quick think, pair, share, pair up. I'll give you about 4 minutes. Just try to answer one of those questions. Thanks for being here. Yeah, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Safe travel.
Okay. Well, you'll be disappointed if we. Okay. So about one more minute, if you want to just wrap up the conversation. Did anybody, which group, did any of you try to answer the first question? Okay, so just some thoughts. What did you share? How would using this multicultural education as a human right change the conversations that you're having here on campus?
And Sid and I have microphones, because turns out I didn't
Oh,
pick it up back
you do
there,
need the
so-
microphones. Yeah, go ahead.
Somebody have a question?
Right here.
He wants me to speak. Oh, let Alan talk. I think that a couple of things that we thought, if you accept the idea that it's a right, then everything that you do in terms of preparing teachers or the classroom, K-12 teacher or whatever, is geared toward having everyone understand that they need to be culturally responsive in the situation. But then I asked the question, okay, so if I identify a dozen different cultures in my classroom, does that mean I need to instruct each culture differently? Is there a global approach to this? And I know that there's a variety of ways to be able to do that. One of the things we have in our education program is we recognize that currently, because of the nature of our region, our student teachers don't get a lot of exposure to diversity in some locations. And so our accrediting people say, well, your teachers must have exposure to diversity. And there's, it's kind of locked into, that means they must be physically present. But what I'm understanding in this context is that we can approach that without them necessarily being physically present with that diversity.
Okay, good. So, I do think, first of all, recognizing that, that everybody has a culture. I think that starting with that, I do recognize the incredible challenges. As you may have heard, I was at the University of Wyoming for 11 years. You were, yeah. So, which I always thought the state was spelled W-H-Y-O-I-M-N-G, because people would say, Wyoming. But I think, certainly starting with who students are, and you may be surprised, I think, when you talk to your students and have them share their stories about where they're from and what people don't know about them in terms of their cultural identities. I think, this is a really great opportunity for us to figure out how can we get people out into communities. I'm thinking a little bit about a project that's done at Illinois State University, where they put teachers in Chicago public schools for 4 weeks to actually have home visits. I mean, they're placed with homes in that community, the largely Latino community, the Pilsen community there in Chicago, and the African American community. They bring community leaders in as their teachers, along with teacher educators and then classroom teachers, because it's a summer project, where they come to learn about. And this is, again, the same situation where they're at, there's just very few diverse students, and so they felt really compelled to say, we're going to now send you across and put you in schools. For those of you who might be interested, Ball State has won a couple of awards recently. Just this year, they were recognized by the AACTE with the Diversity Award. Ball State's a very non-diverse community, and they felt like they had to do something, and so they really reached out to working also with community-based organizations and putting their students in diverse settings. So it's challenging, but I think there's some good models of how to be out there and to do that work. With respect to learning about students, I always think about learning about my own students first. So if you have multiple students or students from multiple ethnic and religious groups, not linguistic groups, for example, if your students get placed in Portland schools, they may have schools, there's schools all over the world that have multiple languages, multiple cultural frameworks. We talk about trying to learn the local cultural repertoires of practice. So that is, and that's work that Chris Gutierrez is doing, where the idea is not to take some kind of understanding about what it means to be Latino or Laotian or Vietnamese or whatever group you're talking about, but to actually try to learn from the students themselves about how does being in your particular social group, social identity group, what are the practices associated with that are specific here, that are localized here? And so that's Barbara Rogoff, Chris Gutierrez and Barbara Rogoff call that learning about kids' particular local repertoires of practice. So I think those are just a couple of thoughts that I have kind of initially, but those are good questions and really difficult. Good. Anybody else who answered the first question or talked about the first question? You all talked about it, right? Yeah. And any thoughts what was kind of the tenor of your conversation?
We talked about a few different things. One was the acknowledgement that every single individual has an epistemological view of things. Right. And then that takes the pressure or the potential for burden or targeting off of any one group. So particularly when we were talking about recruitment of students from different racial backgrounds to Eastern Oregon University, in the way that we talk about those students, are we creating kind of an unfair burden for them to assimilate into or to accept just their epistemological views? That can get tricky. And then we also talked about the urgency when we think about multicultural education as an ethical obligation, human rights as an ethical obligation, creating more urgency and personal connection for individuals as activists instead of it makes good business sense because the population is right. That's probably true. Shouldn't say it isn't. And it's not what fuels people often, right? So.
Yeah. Good. Very nice. Good.
I have a question that follows up on that because I see that part of it is that pay the educational debt piece I see up there. And I've been thinking a lot about some of my students who end up, even before they're a year into their universities, they have tremendous debt and they don't know how to get out of it and they're not sure how they got into it. And that there's a disconnect sometimes between what we think our students understand about financial aid and what they really understand. I was sharing an experience recently of explaining to two students, Latino students, how to do a summary one-on-one and trying to explain to them how to do it, and they returned revisions and they still weren't close to what I wanted. And then there's an affective filter, one that you don't really understand, but you think I've explained it, they should get it, it's their problem, right? And if money's involved with that, then students can start accruing debt and they don't know how they got there. So I was wondering if you've ever done this kind of training with the financial aid end of it. So because I think there need to be culturally responsive practices in the way that we talk about finances with students, because what we think we're explaining clearly and what they get has to sometimes do with our epistemology completely contradictory to their own. Am I making sense?
Yeah, you are. I think the challenge here is thinking about what do we mean by education debt. So when Martin Luther King wrote about this, and this isn't the I Have a Dream speech, he talked about how the forefathers of the country essentially wrote a check to every person that says, here you can take this to the bank, right? You have this right, you have this right, you have this right, you have this right. And what Martin Luther King was saying is that the check was never given to African American people. That was that they were denied the opportunities that the forefathers envisioned for that. And so, so more contemporarily, what people were thinking about, in particular, Gloria Ladson-Billings, who's also just an amazing, amazing person. She was president of the ARA, the American Education Research Association, and she wrote about the education debt. What is the debt this nation owes to people from diverse backgrounds? What we promised them that they would have, but which we gave, what Martin Luther King said, we gave them a blank check. That one wasn't signed, it didn't have anything on it, and essentially you couldn't cash it, right? So that's really what they're talking about with respect to that. So I think if you go look at her work and what she's talking about in terms of education debt, I think that would be that would be the way that they frame it. Outside of that, I probably need help with my own paycheck. I mean, with my own bank account. I mean, it's just really difficult. I think you're right. We have a project in our community that is working with adults and children to teach them financial literacy skills. And it's a project that is funded by local credit unions mostly. And it actually gives people money to actually begin to work on and gives them, small amounts of money for learning certain tasks like how to open a checking account or how to balance a checkbook or whatever. So, but outside of that, it's probably in terms of if you're thinking about it in terms of the fiscal world.
Well, I just think that there should be this kind of thoughtful pedagogy involved in our teaching
I
of
agree.
financial aid, and of our financial aid, that they're teaching too. And
Right.
But
But that's true everywhere. I mentioned, that the conference that we're having on, science and STEM, right? And this, because I'm assuming for you all like us, it's like STEM is everything, right? All the money needs to go. We have to have more scientists. We have to have more engineers. But there's a particular ideological orientation to that. And so part of our conference is going to kind of deconstruct that ideological orientation around what does it mean to, what constitutes science, right? I'll say maybe encourage you to think about those of you who are interested, but I think it has to cut across everything: finance, science, math, art, music, education, right? It has to permeate across. I want to ask if anybody tried to answer the second question about institutional response or individual response.
Sorry. So I guess I came up with, I realized a challenge that I've been facing that I wasn't sure. It was trying to think about what can the institution do to help close the opportunity gap. And the overarching question that's maybe more general than my specific situation is is it more effective? I think of institutions in general and specifically this one as a Titanic ship that's going in this direction that I'm and I'm always torn between continuing to work in my little lifeboat off the side, doing the work that I feel is touching on some of this stuff and just letting the ship hit the iceberg, right? But then I won't live, right? Because I need the ship to survive. So how much of our time should we spend being on committees and doing these things that are trying to move this Titanic versus actually, I work on the ground with our students in the TRIO program. So I mean, it's not an answerable question, but right. I don't know. I feel so many people in this room are so busy doing all of these things that are amazing. And I don't know, that's what the question I came up with to answer your question.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it has to be both, right? It has to be, how do I, this is the sphere of influence that I have is right here, right? And I'm going to influence that in a really powerful and important way. But as you mentioned, where you're at is nested within a larger unit, right? Whether it's the college level, whether it's a department level. And so you do have an obligation to play an active role in at least also, because that's another area where you have a sphere of influence. But can you, influence, what happens at the broadest level? Maybe not, but at least you're working. And, one of the things that I think about in terms of at least the civil rights movement was that I think oftentimes people think of the civil rights movement in terms of these very first of all, these really amazing individuals and these specific events, right? But it's actually, the civil rights movement was a result of individual, everyday people working in small ways. That's what those were the things that were the catalysts to then a major event to happen or a prominent shero or hero to step into a particular role. Those of you, those people like, the dean and I always say I don't do most of this work, actually. It's the people who are and doing the day-to-day work in classrooms and in committees and whatever. That's where the real work's getting done. And they allow me, that work that individuals do in their own spheres of influence and in the spheres of influence right above them, really they're the ones that catalyze the work that I'm able to do then as a dean. So I don't know if you'd agree with me, but. Good, great answer, though. Great thing to be struggling with. Somebody else? Okay, I have one other thought. Sorry, I'm going to come back. Maybe it's not a life raft. Maybe you got to imagine yourself as a tugboat, and you're just trying to push the ship a little bit here, or maybe push the ship a little bit here, or maybe you're like, oh, yes, we can do this, or sometimes pushing it from behind. So that's a vision, actually, kind of an image that I keep in my head, is that I feel like this little tugboat trying to push this big system. The challenge for us is that education's been both the dark and the light. There's been things about American public education that have been really dark, that continue to be really dark, but it's also been really light. I mean, the fact that I was able to, not without a lot of challenge, those of you who come tonight, I will be sharing some of the challenges along the educational pathway for myself. But there were important opportunities and important things that I was able to learn, and important people I met along the way that absolutely, as I mentioned from the get-go, whose shoulders I stand on.
One other thing that I was thinking about with regards to the second question, and Susan and Naomi both, I think, hit on this, but working within student services, I think when we think about pedagogy, if we can apply that to this like expanded idea of like every part of the university is part in the educational mission, right? Like, so a visit to financial aid is an educational opportunity. A visit to academic advising is an educational opportunity. And I think that there are a lot of individuals who embrace that idea, but institutionally, if that's part of the expectation of that, I think it changes the opportunities for people who work within those positions to feel like this is accessible to the work that they do, that there's a much more direct connection when the institution values those jobs as educational jobs.
Right.
And then provides like training and support and an expectation of that people perform as such. So yeah,
that's great.
my opinion.
I'm going to stop there. I'm not even going to respond. That's fabulous. Thank you. I agree.
All right. Well, it's time to wrap it up. So thank you all for coming. Please do give us your feedback. Let's give Dr. Rios a hand.
Yeah, thank you.
If you're able to return tonight, I promise the message is totally different.
Totally different.
It will be very beneficial to all of you. If you can't come, you can watch it online later. But thank you all for coming, and we'll be here for 5 minutes or so if someone wanted to come and ask further questions. But that's all we have for now. Thank you all.